Live from the BDN Studios, it's Bang and Dang.
That's awesome.
If you don't like that, then
You ain't black.
Once again, for some more battles in American Civil War behind the battles. And like we told you last week, next couple of weeks, we're going to be covering some atrocities or war crimes, however you want to look at them. Either or, they were pretty messed up stuff.
oh wow.
Wow. This week, we're going to be tackling the Union side that everybody says is so innocent. Well, people in the know.
Right.
But talk about the Sand Creek Massacre, November 29th, 1864. About 700 volunteers of the Colorado Territory's 3rd Cavalry. They marched into an encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians, killed about 150 to 200 of them. Vast majority were women, children, and elderly non-combatants. So remember, right? Weren't a lot of the guys away or something?
Mm-hmm.
They offered little resistance, and boy, there was a inquiry about this afterwards. You better believe it.
Should have been. Shit.
But, as you would believe, none of the people in charge got charged with anything.
Why
So
would
that tells
they?
you everything you need to know.
Right.
Before we get into that, we'll get a little background of this area and how we lead to it. So, Congress, they carved the territory of Colorado out the frontier, February 28th, 1861. That's it, really. It was less about tiny borders or tidy borders and more about wrangling the chaos that came with the Pikes Peak Gold Rush.
Right.
That rush kicked off in 1858 and sent a wave of dreamers, some 100,000, toward the Rocky with visions of easy gold dancing in their heads. Most didn't make it that far. About 40,000 did, scattering across the landscape to stake claims, hammer together mining camps, and turn dusty wagon stops into boom towns. Denver City, just a few years old, suddenly a bustling hub of tents, saloons, and supply depots feeding the fever. Yeah, Denver used to be one of the biggest cities.
Yeah.
By the 1860 census, the future Colorado Territory counted just over 34,000 non-Indian residents. Well, almost all of them were men. Out of the entire lot, only about 1,500 were women, which tells you everything about what kind of place this was. Loud, transient, and teetering between civilization and lawlessness. That imbalance came a loud call for some kind of organized government to keep the peace, secure mining claims, and settle the inevitable disputes that came with too many people chasing too little gold and going on other people's plots. And
From 1861 to 1864, population, it didn't just grow, guys. It spread like
STIs
wildfire,
or
right?
fucking
Yeah.
Wild West town.
Mining continued in the mountains as usual. Farmers and ranchers, they began to take over the river valleys, setting up homesteads, irrigation ditches to feed the miners.
Look at that.
Counties sprang up, roads, forts, follow along. Colorado's fast becoming more than a rough mining camp. It was turning into a structured territory. It was like a main stop between the west and the east. They had taxes, they had sheriffs, all the trapping of permanence. But for the Native Americans who already called this land home, you got the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and others. The boom spelled disaster. They're like, oh, here we go again. A sudden influx of settlers stripped the land bare. Buffalo herds thinned out to almost nothing. Over 10 million buffaloes were killed between 18... No, it's insane, dude. Like 100 million, actually.
A lot.
Timber and water grew scarce. Hunting grounds that had sustained generations of tribes were fenced off. They were mined or plowed. The treaties that were supposed to protect the natives, well, they're treated more like a vague suggestion than binding agreements, as we said in our last episode.
Right.
By 1864, the tension was impossible to ignore. The miners wanted gold. Settlers wanted farmland. Tribes wanted just to survive.
Right.
What started as competing needs for food, water, and wood had hardened into a standoff of who would control the territory's future. This would be a conflict that would soon turn deadly on the plains of Colorado. Fucking white people.
Right. Before it was even a territory, obviously, Cheyenne and Arapaho, they already made their mark on the land, both literally and legally.
Well, they had to leave.
Right. Their territorial claims came from the Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed September 17th, 1851, which was an agreement that was supposed to put things in writing once and for all, but we know, according to that treaty, Cheyenne and Arapaho territory began at Butte, where the immigrant road split from the North Fork of the Platte River. From there, it ran up that fork to its source, followed the main range of the Rocky Mountains down to the headwaters of both the South Fork of the Platte River and the Arkansas River.
Yep.
Then down the Arkansas to where it crossed the Santa Fe Road And finally, northwest back up to the Platte Forks, completing a massive loop of land that made up what we know now as eastern Colorado,
Right.
including the entire Pikes Peak region where that gold is discovered.
Mm-hmm. In return for recognizing that claim, the United States wanted something, as they always fucking do. Safe passage for immigrants.
Is that too much to ask?
Hey, man, if you see somebody coming through with the bandwagon, just leave them alone. Leave them alone. They're going to have designated trails. Just leave them alone. I mean, I can see if they wandered off into...
Just leave me alone.
They wanted to, the right to build roads and forts. And the promise that those traveling through would be left unmolested. In exchange,
harassed at all. Though.
Right. In exchange, the tribes were promised annual payments, annuities, worth about $50,000 a year for 10 years.
What's up, man?
Along with additional goods and the federal government's supposed protection from outside aggression. It seems like a good deal. But it keeps on shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. These guys are like, come on, motherfucker. To the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the treaty wasn't just a handshake deal, it was a guarantee.
What's it?
It secured that they believed to be their exclusive rights to live, to hunt, and sustain their people within those boundaries. Hey, buddy, I understand. We'll take care of this little boundaries here and you just leave us alone. The United States, by signing and taking on the responsibility to keep intruders out and enforce those borders as well.
They were supposed to, but that ink had barely dried before things started to unravel. When the gold rush exploded in 1858, we know thousands came. They didn't just pass through, they stayed. They dug up riverbeds, cut all the timber, state claims all over the 1851 treaty land. So, geez. The agreement's promise of safe passage had turned into permanent occupation. The U.S. government wasn't delivering the goods or protection it promised.
All right. So can you blame these engines for be like, hey, we can't continue the safe passage thing.
Especially because
they would not be unmolested.
Right. Payments were delayed, resources stretched thin. The tribe's hunting grounds were being eaten away by the flood of newcomers.
This is sad.
Well, they protested, insisting they still had sovereignty over the lands as defined in the treaty. But Washington, they have other ideas. February 18th, 1861, U.S. negotiated a brand new agreement, which was the Treaty of Fort Wise. Under this deal, the Cheyenne, six Cheyenne chiefs and 4 Arapaho chiefs, they supposedly ceded all the land they claimed in 1851, except for a small reservation about 640,000 acres,
Right.
which is tucked between the Arkansas and the South Platte River. I don't know, supposedly, right?
Right.
In return, the government promised schools, farming equipment, and larger annual payments. The classic package meant to encourage the tribes to settle down and farm. Right? Why not just do that?
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying they should only have 640,000 acres, but, I mean, you guys got to farm, bud.
Right. Here's where things get murky.
Schmurky.
The chiefs who signed at Fort Wise, they made it clear that they were only speaking for their own bands, not for the entire Cheyenne or the Arapaho.
I mean, you got 6 chiefs
Right.
of each, 4
Right.
on the other one. That's probably a lot of people.
Right. And the majority of the leaders back home who hadn't been there and hadn't agreed, they fled out, said,
What's that remind you of?
I don't.
Just last week's episode.
Right. It's like, I'm not acknowledging that. They saw it as betrayal, unrepresentative. We weren't there.
We already
Right.
signed a treaty for this shit, guys. What are you doing?
As far as they were concerned, the land from the old Fort Laramie boundaries still belonged to them.
Right.
They continued to
I
hunt.
agree with them.
Right. They continued to hunt buffalo and gather food in those areas.
Damn right. If
Especially-
the fucking white people came in and did it, why can't they?
Right. Especially as the game became scarcer and the promised federal payment late or not at all. United States, well, they took a different view, as always. Federal officials treated the Fort Wise Treaty as a done deal.
I bet they did.
Complete extinguishment of all tribal title to the ceded lands. That gave settlers and miners the green light. Go on, boys. Claim mineral rights and expand settlements deeper into those plains. And then we'll get pissed off at the Cheyenne and Arapaho when they come in and be like, what the fuck?
Right.
Well, speaking of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, they saw that as a direct violation of the earlier 1851 agreement. They weren't wrong. There have been no full tribal consent, no proper compensation, no support for relocation to the reduced reservation.
Yeah, that's dirty.
Dude, these guys yeah, man. Every time I read about it just pisses me off. These motherfuckers.
Well, by 1864, the fallout from these broken promises was obvious. The tribe's anger wasn't coming out of anywhere. We already know it was rooted in a decade of treaties rewritten, land stolen, survival growing harder every year. Cheyenne, Arapaho still viewed their presence in places like Sand Creek, not as an act of trespass or rebellion, but as an exercise of rights guaranteed under that earlier 1851 treaty.
Like, hey, bud, this is our home.
In their eyes, they were standing on ground that was rightfully theirs, land promised, signed, and sealed by the old United States itself.
Come on. Jeez.
Long before the U.S. Army ever rolled on the scene, the Plains tribes, they already had their own code of warfare. We know that. It's a rhythm that came and went with the seasons. Cheyenne and Arapaho, like many of their neighbors, fought for practical reasons. Oh, don't fucking sugarcoat it now, buddies. Practical reasons and pride. I guess, that's still not a reason. To capture horses, avenge past wrongs, and earn glory through feats like counting coup, touching an enemy in battle and living to tell the tale, or taking scalps and captives. So pretty shitty reasons, buddy.
Yeah. I mean, what are you going to do? Cheyenne, who migrated south onto the Great Plains by the early 1800s, forged a close alliance with Arapaho. Together, they fought for survival and status on the open prairie. Their most frequent enemies were, the Pawnee and the Crow. Yeah, Crow was some... These guys occupied some of the best buffalo hunting grounds on the central and northern plains. For a time, they even fought the Sioux before realizing they had bigger problems and bigger enemies. This led to a strategic alliance among the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Sioux against tribes like the Arikara, and others to the north.
These weren't massive organized wars like those fought in the east. They were small-scale raids, lightning fast, and intensely personal.
All right.
War parties typically numbered from a few dozen to maybe a few hundred. They'd strike hard and vanish, often leaving a trail of grudges that could simmer for years. Yeah, just go and slaughter a bunch of people and skitty-boppity-doo out of there. Retaliation was part of the culture. Yes, it was. One raid invited another, and it goes on and on and on.
Son of a bitch.
By the mid-1800s, as horse herds grew and buffalo herds began to thin, the fighting became more frequent. The Cheyenne and Arapaho began coordinating even closer with their Sioux allies, launching joint raids on northern tribes to protect hunting grounds and their way of life.
Damn right.
Specific clashes show that how this dynamic played out. For instance, the Cheyenne-Pawnee feud ran hot through the 40s and 50s, mostly over territory along the Platte River and the Republican Fork regions.
Oh, wow.
The Pawnee, like I said, made things worse because they were scouting for U.S. Army units.
Yeah, because they're pissed because these motherfuckers are giving away their land.
Well, the Cheyenne, they see this as deep betrayal. In those fights, the Cheyenne's dog soldiers, who were their elite warriors, they became legendary. They perfected hit-and-run ambushes, feigned retreats, coordinated attacks that later defined warfare against the U.S. troops that they would have coming up. What started as a tribal defense training would soon double as a battle preparation for the many conflicts ahead.
Well, alliances on those plains, they were flexible.
They're like wrestling. You can turn on anybody in a fucking heartbeat.
Right. Cheyenne, Arapaho partnership, well, it grown out of earlier skirmishes in the 1830s. So they're like, hey, we're fucking with each other back then. Let's just, let's work together. Can't beat them, join them, right? When the two sides decided they'd rather fight together than against each other. Enough has died. Let's move forward. That alliance made them a formidable force, strong enough to hold the ground even as settlers, soldiers, and traders began to push deeper, deeper, and deeper into their little world. This was a constant cycle of raiding, revenge, and it meant that violence was always near the surface. It kept the tribes locked in a state of low-level, rolling warfare, fighting one another just as a far greater storm, white expansion, was gathering on the horizon. As Euro-American settlers began crossing against the plains, greater numbers during the 1840s following the Oregon Trail and the Platte River Trail, the familiar patterns of raiding expanded to include these new arrivals. Cheyenne war parties began targeting wagon trains, often going after livestock and supplies more than blood.
Yeah, but they did the blood too.
Well, they had to get the livestock and supplies. These were opportunities.
I don't think scalping little fucking 2-year-olds were doing anything, but they did it.
They're like, well, they killed our 2-year-old. I killed your 2-year-old.
We killed 10 of yours.
Right. These were opportunistic strikes, acts of frustration. About as much as that with strategy as well.
Yeah. In spring of 1856, Cheyenne warriors raided along overland routes in Kansas, Nebraska, hidden areas near the Solomon and Smoky Hill rivers. They weren't just after horses. They were pushing back against the damage immigrant traffic was doing to grasslands and game. You see, that particular year, the raids, they slowed migration that season enough to draw the U.S. Army's attention. That summer, the Army hit back. July of 1857, Colonel Edwin Sumner, he led a cavalry expedition that caught up with the Cheyenne force at Solomon Fork, Kansas.
Okay.
A little skirmish broke out. 2 soldiers were killed, 8 wounded. While the Cheyenne managed to escape the initial clash, Guess what? Their village was destroyed in the raid that followed.
Fuck.
After that, the fighting simmered out, but never quite stopped. Horse thefts, small raids continued into the early 60s, mostly along Kansas frontier settlements. Yeah, you're in the middle of nowhere. They're coming to raid your shit. These were the acts of young warriors testing themselves, extending their people's old raiding traditions into a new and uncertain era. Losses relatively light, at least compared to the bloodbaths that would come later. Military records from the time show no major Cheyenne attacks on settlers in Colorado before 1864, though.
Really? Yeah.
But the warning signs, they were there. That gold rush, like we know, all these settlers are coming.
Right.
Taking away the buffalo ranges, trampling the pastures. With every wagon that rolled west, tensions tighten like a drawn bowstring, and it's got to either snap or let go.
That's crazy. The intertribal combat experience of the Plains warriors, they were built on speed, surprise, and mobility. This translated directly into how they soon fight the United States Army. No formal battle lines on the Plains, just swift strikes, quicker retreats. Every encounter, whether it started with a buffalo killed by immigrants or a soldier firing first, it threatened to trigger the same old cycle. One side retaliates, the other responds, even harder. It was a loop that never stopped, and it defined life on the Plains for generations.
Exactly what a loop is, bud.
But now, with settlers and soldiers flooding in, right? With settlers and soldiers flooding in, it was about to become something much larger and far more bloody, deadlier, and gruesome like never before. Sad news bears. By spring of 1864, tensions across the Colorado frontier finally snapped. The uneasy peace between settlers and the Plains tribes gave way to open warfare, driven by younger, more militant factions of the Cheyenne that are past. Yeah, these weren't random acts of violence. Nope, they're deliberate. In response of broken treaties, land grabs, and United States expansion. These guys are pissed.
That spring, the warrior societies launched a wave of attacks along the South Platte River east of Denver.
All right.
Their targets were ranches, stage stops, and lonely homesteads. Symbols of the white settlements spreading across what had once been their hunting grounds. They stole horses, cattle, burned buildings, killed ranch hands, striking deep at the economic heart of the young Colorado territory. All the ranch hands are like, what happened to Billy?
Right.
Don't you worry about it. By May 1864, U.S. Army patrols, they were already skirmishing with these roving war parties, reporting what looked less like isolated raids and more like organized efforts by Cheyenne bands to reassert control over the ancestral plains.
Okay.
Then came the attack that changed everything.
Oh, no.
June 11th, 1864, a small ranch on Running Creek, about 25 miles southeast of Denver, became the center of a nightmare that would send shockwaves through the territory. The Hungate family, Nathan, his wife, and their 5-year-old daughter, Laura.
Oh, no.
They were killed when Cheyenne or Arapaho warriors descended on their ranch.
Son of a bitch.
The attackers used arrows and hatchets, killing the family before scalping and mutilating the bodies. Acts of brutality intended to terrify their enemies. Consistent with warrior customs of the time, too. Wow. You want to just embarrass these guys.
Wow. Settlers discovered the aftermath. They brought the bodies back to Denver. They were publicly displayed. Let's get the fuck out of here. They did that a lot. I don't understand.
Yeah. Why do you think?
Right.
Gotta give outrage.
Right. A grisly sight that electrified the population. It did. Word spread very fast. Killings were widely described as the Hungate Massacre. They ignited a wave of panic across Colorado. Settlers, this was proof that the frontier was under siege, and no family, no matter how small or remote, was safe at all.
Right.
Throughout the summer of 1864, the violence spread. Cheyenne and Arapaho, the war parties moved north and east along the overland trails, targeting freight wagons, stagecoaches, and mail stations that followed the Platte River. They killed drivers, passengers, burned wagons, destroyed property worth thousands of dollars. Telegraphs cut. The lines were cut, isolating towns and forts for weeks at a time. Small communities found themselves surrounded by silence. No news, no supplies, no reinforcements.
No way to send for help. Civilian deaths mounted. By year's end, official estimates put the number of white casualties killed and wounded about 91 across the territory, which
a lot.
Might not sound like a lot, but it's a lot. One is one too many. For a frontier that was still sparsely settled, that number hit hard. The raids severed the trade routes that kept the mining camps and towns alive, forcing supply convoys to travel under military escort or not even come at all.
Right. Holy shit.
It is important to note that not all Cheyenne or Arapaho leaders, not all, but some, but most, Not all leaders supported this course of violence.
Mm-hmm.
The raids were carried out by aggressive warrior societies, not the peace-seeking chiefs who would still hope to negotiate with U.S. officials.
Right. Good luck.
But nuance, it tends to vanish in times of fear. To most settlers, every attack looked like a part of one united Indian uprising, and they all had to go.
Mm-hmm.
And with the Cheyenne and Arapaho alliances now overlapping with Lakota bands, the threat seemed even larger.
Mm-mm-mm. Oh, by late summer of 1864, the Colorado frontier had transformed to a state of siege. Settlers wanted revenge, as well as the Indians. The army wanted order, as well as the Indians.
Right.
And the tribes, well, divided between those who fought and those who still sought peace, they were being pulled toward a collision that would culminate in one of the most darkest days in frontier history. And you guessed it, folks, Sand Creek.
The reason we're all gathered around this campfire right now.
By the summer of 1864, the Colorado frontier was teetering on the edge of full-scale war. The Cheyenne, Arapaho, the raids that they were doing, which had been simmering for months, they turned deadly, and panic gripped settlements. The killing of the Hungate family had become the rallying cry for action. Well, in that response, Territorial Governor John Evans, he said, you know what? We ain't even going to ask Washington. I'm going to tell you guys what to do. Because on the 27th of June, 1864, Evans issued a proclamation aimed at separating friend from foe. He instructed all so-called friendly Indians, meaning any Cheyenne, Arapaho, or any other tribes to engage in hostilities to report to United States military posts, such as Fort Lyon and Fort Laramie. But like, hey,
not engage in hostilities.
Right. Like, hey, bud, we're
all you peaceful ones, you come here. We'll protect you, and then we're going to go annihilate everybody else you know and love.
Right. And that's where you decide you come here and you're protected. There's a catch, though. Any native groups remain out on the plains, they become hostile. In other words...
Yeah, but how do you fucking get that word out to thousands and thousands of fucking tribes or people, dude? Come on now.
Here's what they said. You stay near the forts and live, or you travel away from the forts and stay free and risk being hunted down.
Free, huh? That's a good word. On paper, Evans framed it as a safety measure.
Oh, I bet he did.
It's an effort to protect peaceful bands from being mistaken for enemies amid the growing chaos, I guess. But in practice, it also meant corralling non-combatants under military oversight.
Exactly.
Keeping them out of the way while U.S. troops and now civilians prepared for what was coming. So why wouldn't they say the civilians, you come live near us too?
Right.
Reports of raids on ranches and wagon trains were mounting by the week, bringing with them stories of civilian deaths, livestock theft, burned settlements. To the governor, the territory was under siege. He wasn't about to wait for Washington to solve it.
Nope.
As the attacks intensified, Evans took an even harder line. August 11th, 1864, he issued his second proclamation, one that dropped all pretense of restraint. This time he authorized Colorado citizens, whether acting alone or as part of a group, doesn't matter, said arm yourself, pursue, you go hunt any hostile Indians on sight.
And when he says hostile, that was loosely
basically
Indian. Indian, right?
Treaties don't matter. Federal approval didn't matter. They were deemed belligerent. They were fair game.
We won't try you in our courts, bud.
Right.
Wow.
Evans justifies this as a matter of self-defense, arguing that constant depredations by Indian raiders had disrupted mining operations, ranching, and overland travel, threatening the very survival of the Colorado Territory. The federal army was stretched thin. There's a civil war going back.
Right.
So he told the settlers, take justice in their own hands. Whatever, dude.
Yep.
In effect, his proclamation deputized civilians as frontier militia. Neighbors, miners, and ranchers, and little 14-year-old boys turned soldiers overnight.
What a time. What a place.
Right.
Wow. But Evans wasn't just encouraging vigilance. No.
Or vigilantes.
He wanted a formal military response as well. So later that August, he secured approval from the War Department to raise a new volunteer unit. It would be called the 3rd Regiment of the Colorado Cavalry Volunteer. Would be a short-term force, 100-day enlistment, about 1,000 mounted troops.
100 days, plenty of time to fuck some shit up.
Yep. Recruited mostly from Denver and surrounding areas. Their mission, well, simple. Rapid deployment against Indians. That's all you gotta do.
Right.
To lead them, Evans chose none other than Colonel John Shivington. This is a man who embodied both zeal and controversy. Shivington was a Methodist minister turned soldier, a veteran of earlier militia actions in the territory, commanding presence with reputation for fiery sermons and a unrelenting hatred for the Plains tribes. He ate Indians.
You can't be a clergy guy, Methodist minister, and hate people, bud.
No,
Sorry. It doesn't work that way.
Right. He was charismatic. He was ambitious. Even history would soon show dangerously eager to prove himself. New recruits were hastily trained and equipped, some with sabers and some with revolvers. Others with rifled muskets. Well, they were in short supply. Pay bounties and land grants incentives sweetened the deal, attracting the mix of men, frontier settlers looking for security, miners seeking to pay between claims, and adventurers drawn by both vengeance and opportunity.
I just want to go kill some people.
Right. Wow.
Psychopaths.
By the fall of 1864, elements of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, alongside detachments of the 1st Colorado Cavalry, well, they were already patrolling the eastern plains. Governor Evans, he kept up a steady correspondence with scouts and ranchers. He gathered intelligence on the movement of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Denver settlers, the mood had shifted. This wasn't about defense anymore. Nope, not at all. It was about retribution, motherfuckers. And under Evans and Shivington, that retribution was about to take a brutal, infamous shape.
By the fall of 1864, the Southern Cheyenne, they were split down the middle. Inside their camps, two very different visions of the future were fighting for control. We got the one, the elders, most likely, that sought peace, and the old youngins demon to prove themselves and keep that spine that we always had. They wanted war.
All right.
The older chiefs, men like Black Kettle, believed survival depended on restraint and diplomacy.
Right.
They argued the tribe's best hope was to honor treaties and negotiate with the ever-growing wave of American settlers flooding their land.
Hey, man, just negotiate, bud. Try.
Live peacefully, side by side, can't we?
Easily.
Two-state nation. Black Kettle, he was known as voice of reason. He was steady, deliberate, and painfully aware that the U.S. Army could fucking just go in and just annihilate everybody if they wanted.
Easily.
He spent much of 1864 trying to hold his young warriors back.
Couldn't do it.
Urging them not to strike out against settlers, even as tensions mounted.
Right.
But the younger men, they weren't listening. Among the dog soldiers, the Cheyenne's elite, yes. Patience, they'd worn thin. To them, talk of peace looked like surrender, like little pussies.
Right.
They operated largely on their own, ignoring orders from the peace chiefs, and conducting raids against wagon trains, ranches, and frontier settlements.
Wow.
August 1864, their fury boiled over in a series of devastating attacks along the Little Blue River in Kansas, leaving civilians dead and farms burned to the ground.
Son of a bitch.
For these warriors, every raid was both revenge and survival, a way to reclaim horses, provisions, and pride.
Right.
But their actions also had devastating political consequences.
I bet.
Every strike by the dog soldiers, it made it harder for men like Black Kettle to secure peace. And he said, if you guys keep doing this, we're never going to, they're just going to not ever make peace with us, and they'll eliminate us, guys. What are you doing?
Wow. The split within the tribe came into sharp focus 28th of September, 1864. This is when the peace chiefs took an extraordinary step. Black Kettle and other Cheyenne Arapaho leaders traveled to Camp Weld, just outside of Denver. They wanted to meet face to face with the old Governor Evans and Colonel Shivington. The meeting was tense from the very start. The chiefs came with open hands, hoping to calm things down before winter. They promised that their people would stop fighting. They lied. They couldn't. They couldn't promise.
Right,
that.
they can't promise.
Right. Black Cat himself pledged to keep his band from any further hostilities. As a sign of good faith, he even returned white captives that had been taken during earlier dog soldier raids.
Good for him.
This is a very powerful gesture, meant to show that he was serious.
Dude, I just want to live in peace, man.
I just want to live. They weren't convinced that one bit. Still, the chiefs agreed to move their followers near United States military posts where they would be considered friendly. Chosen site was a quiet band on the Sand Creek. This is where they would encamp under what they believed would be an army protection. To Black Kettle, this was a temporary solution. It was proof that his people could be trusted while larger negotiations being worked out. Hey, bud, we'll be here. You can watch us.
Right.
The Shivington and the territorial government, though, well, it blurred an already messy line.
Well, that's because even as Black Kettle's band camped peacefully, the dog soldiers and other militant groups, they kept on raiding. They rejected the Camp Weld agreements entirely, seeing them as a submission to an enemy that didn't recognize them as legitimate anyway.
Right.
These breakaway warriors formed independent war bands, continuing their attacks on settlers and freight routes deep into the fall. To the territorial authorities watching from Denver, it all looked the same. The distinction between peaceful and hostile Cheyenne became impossible to maintain. Of course it did. Every Indian attack was lumped together, and the army began to view them as one united enemy. That internal schism within Cheyenne society between peace chiefs who valued diplomacy and the warrior societies who They just want to cut off people's freaking scalps, set the stage for tragedy. Resources, pressure, starvation, and government neglect pushed the two sides further apart.
Right.
Until communication with the U.S. officials became nearly impossible. Later congressional investigations would note that this divide was clear. While some Cheyenne warriors had indeed committed atrocities,
They did.
men like Black Kettle represented a large, mostly peaceful faction that had sought accommodation, not war.
Come on now.
But in the chaos of 1864, few settlers or soldiers cared about such distinctions.
No, they didn't give a shit.
To them, every Cheyenne carried the same guilt, and that misunderstanding, which was the failure to see those internal divisions, would help pave the road straight to Sand Creek. All they had is hatred in their hearts. They just want to kill everybody.
Yeah.
Not realizing, hey, they're going through what our country's going through right now. They're literally divided.
Right. Insanity, dude. That's fucking crazy. Let's take a look at events leading to this very attack. By the summer of 1864, Colorado frontier had turned into a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
Reports poured in almost daily about the dog soldiers and the Sioux warriors and raiding settlements, cutting supply lines, Denver, harassing wagon trains, everything far in between getting murdered. Governor John Evans felt it closing in. Federal army tied up fighting the Civil War back east. He knew help wasn't coming. So Evans decided Colorado would have to defend itself. Well, as we said, true to his word, Black Kettle, he did gather his followers and get closer to the forts. Some 750 Cheyenne, most of them women, children, and elders, along with 200 warriors. Led them to a quiet bend along Sand Creek, as we said, about 40 miles northeast of Fort Lyon. Site familiar. Long
Still
used.
not even near the fort, though.
Right. Long used as a seasonal encampment, and it was sat within the territory recognized in the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. When they arrived in late October 1864, they erected around 140 to 150 lodges and turned loose roughly 2,000 horses to graze along the creek.
Okay.
From every indication, it was peaceful. The village was nice, good stuff.
Just smoke billowing from teepees and just people getting on their days.
Black Kettle believed he had followed every instruction to the T. He had people come in and as ordered. They were close enough to Fort Lyon to be under the Army's eye, but far enough away to maintain their own rhythm of daily life, hunting, tending horses, and trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy after months of fear and hunger. Major Winecoop, still sympathetic to the tribe, he confirmed their good faith in his reports. He said they're doing everything they're supposed to do. He said they're non-hostile. And he said Black Kettle, he was actively restraining his young warriors to prevent any further violence.
He did say that. He said, I can personally guarantee my band of people aren't going to do shit. Not everybody else.
Right. To make his loyalty unmistakable, Black Kelly.
Whoa, Black Kelly. Bam, blam, Black Kelly had a voice. Bam, damn things gone wild.
Right. To make his loyalty unmistakable, Black Kettle, he raised 2 flags over his lodge. You can guess which one it was. A white flag of truce, and above it, an American flag. The same one he had given. He'd been given years earlier by the United States.
You ever want to say you're a friendly tribe, you fly this damn flag.
Right. It fluttered in the wind above the camp as a silent promise. And it said that here, under these banners, his people were safe. Your people are safe. Right. We all are safe.
Well, that was the belief, at least. The Cheyenne thought they were under Army's protection, await new instructions.
These guys are idiots.
Right.
Once again.
Food deliveries, maybe even the chance to sign a fresh treaty.
Yeah, good luck.
In reality, they were sitting in the open, unarmed, exposed, separated from the more militant Cheyenne to the north. Their relocation to Sand Creek was meant to isolate Black Kettle's peaceful faction from the dog soldiers and position themselves for future negotiations.
Right.
But those very steps, compliance, relocation, and faith in military promises, would soon prove catastrophic.
Oh, my.
What Black Kettle saw as a gesture of trust, others would interpret as an opportunity. Within weeks, the banners of peace flying over Sand Creek would become tragic symbols of betrayal no one in the camp could have ever imagined.
Oh, my goodness.
By the close of months of 1864, military intelligence in the Colorado Territory was more rumor than reconnaissance. Patchwork of scout dispatches, telegraph summaries, and frontier hearsay strung together from outposts like Fort Lyon and Fort Larned. Larned. What those reports painted was a picture of unease across the eastern plains. Scattered Cheyenne and Arapaho bands moving freely, gathering supplies even wherever the hell they want.
All right.
And according to anxious officers, they were plotting further attacks on settlements and wagon routes.
Look at those bastards. They're just plotting already.
Jeez.
Wow.
Those plotting bastards.
Wow. Through June and July, scouts tracking raiding parties traced their trails back across the high plains. They found signs of horse-mounted warriors, several hundred strong, mostly dog soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Moving between the Smoky Hill and Republican rivers. There are reports that claim that the camps of 1,000 to 2,000 people were assembling there, setting up lodges and stockpiling food for the winter. To the soldiers reading those dispatches, it looked like war preparation to them, especially coming so soon after the Hungate family killings on the 11th of June, which were still fresh in everybody's mind. All those messages made their way up to the chain of command. They stoked fear. Major George Shoup's patrols returned from the plains, estimating 200 to 500 lodges clustered along the Arkansas River tributaries by early October, and his findings only reinforced what old Governor Evans had already believed. He believed that there were large bands that were massing for a coordinated campaign. Those reports, they helped justify Evans' August 11th proclamation, the one that authorized volunteers to pursue and destroy.
Yep.
Search in!
Pursue and destroy!
And those hostile Indians found roaming the plains, I want them attacked.
Right.
To the governor.
Destroy them.
Right. To the governor, the intelligence confirmed what he'd been saying all summer.
I told you I was right.
We're under siege, boys.
Well, by mid-November, the picture it narrowed. Scouts operating out of Fort Lyon began sending back more specific intelligence. They'd pinpointed what they described as a major Cheyenne encampment at the confluence of Sand Creek and the Big Sandy River about 40 miles northeast of the fort. Those reports said the camp included about 130 lodges, occupied by about 500 to 700 people, mostly women, children, and elders, but with a contingent of able-bodied men, quote-unquote, led by Chief Black Kettle, Chief White Antelope, and Chief Left Hand of the Arapaho.
Well, at first, local scouts and interpreters, including some under Captain Silas Soule, they believe this group was peaceful.
What do you mean at first?
Right.
I guess, yes.
They had, after all, come south under the assurances made at the Camp Weld conference back in September. These were the very people who had obeyed the orders to camp near the forts for safety. But when intelligence reached Colonel John Shivington, the tone changed. Reports mentioned scalped horses, captured livestock amongst the villagers. Circumstantial signs that some warriors might have been taking part in the earlier raids. That was enough for Shivington. He said, "Oh, fuck no." In his operational orders, he labeled the camp a hostile Indian stronghold. What a piece of shit. He claimed that it sheltered raiders who had wintered near Fort Lyon and were regrouping for future attacks. He saw it as an opportunity for preemptive strike before those bands could join forces with others on the plains. Like, we got to take care of this son of a bitch right now.
Well, later, as we'll see, congressional investigations that would tear those reports apart. Officers who had been there, Soule among them, testified there had been no hostile demonstrations from the camp at all. They noted that the village had raised both an American flag and a white flag, like we said, which are the universal signs of peace which were visible above Black Kettle's lodge.
All right.
The intelligent, it turned out, relied heavily on unverified trail signs.
Obviously.
Vague witness statements. And an atmosphere of fear that blurred fact and paranoia.
Jeez, guys, come on now.
And still, those reports reflected the mood of the frontier. Plains tribes' seasonal movements, their habit of shifting camps towards sheltered creeks and river bottoms to prepare for winter, they were misread as military mobilization. While the warrior depredations of 1864, more than 100 settlers killed across Colorado and Kansas, were real enough, territorial officials saw those numbers not as isolated revenge raids, but as proof of a unified uprising.
Well, that belief, the Plains tribes were acting as one force, it drove the preemptive mobilization that followed. Yet, the dispatches that justified it were deeply flawed, as usual. They never even clearly distinguished combatants from non-combatants, or they didn't even confirmed who was actually in those camps. But by the time those doubts surfaced, it was way too late. The machinery of war was already in motion. And the intelligence, accurate or not, who gives a shit, right? Shivington said, I don't care. He got what he needed, an excuse to strike. Shivington, he's a towering, sharp-featured former Methodist minister turned soldier who saw himself as Colorado's hammer of justice. By late November 1864, he commanded a frontier army of about 700 volunteers, most of them from a hastily assembled 3rd Colorado Cavalry Regiment. This was no polished professional force, not even close. There were miners, there were ranchers, there were clerks, there were drifters, some chasing pay bounties, others vengeance, many driven by a mix of fear and anger after months of frontier violence. So you got a bunch of guys you're not going to be able to control.
Right. This column also included detachments from the 1st Colorado Cavalry, the battle-hardened veterans of earlier frontier fights, and an artillery contingent armed with 4 12-pounder mountain howitzers. They're small but deadly guns built to travel fast and fire high-explosive shells into tight clusters. Under Shivington's overall command were 2 key subordinates, Major Scott J. Anthony leading 1 battalion,
and Captain Silas Soule commanding another. Both were seasoned, but they couldn't have been more different. Anthony was loyal and eager to act, while Soule, who had seen his share of combat, had deep misgivings about what was coming. He's like, I don't know about this.
3rd Colorado Cavalry made up the bulk of the expedition, numbering somewhere between 500 and 600 men, depending on which report you believe. They came from Denver, Golden, and scattered settlements across the territory. And though they carried sabers and rifles, most lacked proper training, like we said before. They called themselves the Bloody Third, a nickname they wore like a badge of pride. Shivington divided them into 3 battalions, laying out a plan built on speed, shock, and surprise. The orders, well, they're grimly clear. Take no prisoners among hostile Indians. That very column left Denver on the 23rd of November, 1864, marching southeast through the cold winds of the plains. They followed a route through Camp Fillmore and down toward Fort Lyon, covered more than 200 miles in 5 days. A brutal pace across open country. They ended up arriving on the 28th of November. They're tired, they're hungry, they're cold, they're fueled by adrenaline and rumor.
Once at Fort Lyon, Chivington took no chances with secrecy. He posted guards around the fort, forbidding any communication between his men and anyone who might warn the nearby Indian camp. Not even the officers stationed there were told the full plan. About 8 p.m. November 28th, after hastily adding Fort Lyon detachments to his ranks, Chivington gave the order to move out. The column mounted up and began a 40-mile night march north along the frozen bends of Sand Creek. The air, bitterly cold. Horses stumbled through darkness. Men whispered in their saddles, their breath rising in the clouds as the only sound came from creaking leather and the clink of gear. Maybe a little river running, right? Guided by scouts, they moved silently through the night. Not so silent. Aiming to reach the Cheyenne village by first light.
Oh, they can do it.
November 29th, 1864. In the faint, icy gray before dawn, Colonel John Milton Chivington's force of roughly 700 men from the 1st and 3rd Colorado, they crept in position above the sleeping Cheyenne and Arapaho village. Just before sunrise, Chivington divided his command. Major Scott Anthony led one wing north of the camp, while Colonel George Shoup maneuvered south. The plan was to envelop the village, cutting off any escape. The men took their positions quietly among the ridges, waiting for the first glint of daylight to reveal their targets. At 6 a.m., the stillness broke. The order to charge was given, and the line of mounted soldiers surged forward. Spencer carbines cracked, pouring volleys into the village as the mountain howitzers fired shell after shell into the lodges. Explosive rounds tearing through hides and canvas, igniting fires where families had been sleeping minutes earlier.
Jeez. Fucking insane. Inside that very camp, Chief Black Kettle emerged from his lodge in disbelief. He shouted for his people to stay calm and stand their ground, believing the soldiers would recognize the American flag and the white flag of truce flying above his teepee. Same flags had been raised in peace during prior meetings. Symbols of protection and trust, he thought. There was no mercy that morning, though. Chivington was a piece of shit, ready for blood. The troops kept firing, riding straight through the lines of lodges, cutting down anyone who ran. Panic swept that very camp. 200 to 500 inhabitants, most of them women, children, elders, scattered in all directions like cockroaches when you turn on the kitchen light at 2 a.m. Small knots of Cheyenne warriors, a few dozen at most. They fought desperately from cover, firing their rifles from the edges of the village before falling back to the dry creek bed. Well, they had to do something, right? Shit. Among them was George Bent. He was a mixed interpreter who would later survive to tell that very story. He and others fired until the smoke made it impossible to see. Then they ducked into hastily dug sand pits for protection.
In the chaos, the elderly chief White Antelope stepped forward unarmed. He raised his hands, singing a peace song. Nothing lives long, only the earth and the mountains. Before he could finish, he was shot and fell where he stood. As the assault unfolded, discipline began to collapse. Major Anthony's men pursued fleeing villagers down into the creek bed, where they dismounted and fired into the ravines and pits where people hid. To the south, Shoup's larger wing swept through the heart of the village, setting lodges ablaze and shooting those who emerged from the flames.
Jeez.
What had begun as an organized assault quickly fucking broke down in the most chaotic pursuit and killed fucking just pieces of shit running wild. You let a dog off a chain and he's just attacking everything.
I mean, all they really had to do, if they wanted to, is just surround the guys and check the situation out.
Bring them into the fort for questioning or something.
Right. I mean, come on.
Or at least the warriors.
Right. Gather up the warriors and be like, hey.
Goodness.
Jeez. few officers tried to rein in the slaughter. Captain Silas Soule, leading one detachment, refused to even give an order to fire. He and his men stood aside, horrified by what they witnessed. But across the creek, others pressed the attack up to the bluffs. This is where terrified survivors fled. Shots echoed for hours. Damn. As soldiers hunted down stragglers through the brush. That's just ridiculous. By mid-morning, the gunfire began to fade. Smoke from burning lodges drifted across the plains, and the camp, gone, reduced to ash and silence and blood. Bodies lay scattered for miles along the creek bed, men, women, children, cut down where they'd run or huddled for cover. The attack Chivington had planned as a clean military victory had disintegrated into something else entirely. It was a massacre, plain and simple.
Mm-hmm. The official report would call it a triumph. The men, they would call it revenge. Those who had seen it up close, Soule among them, knew what it truly was. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter of a village that had believed it was under the protection of the very flag flying over it. When the smoke finally cleared over Sand Creek, the horde left behind defied easy numbers. Even in the immediate aftermath, reports of native casualties were widely inconsistent. Some claiming 100 dead, others saying 5 times that number. Over time, the lower estimates, about 150 killed, became the most widely accepted. It was echoed by officers, witnesses, and later congressional inquiries as well. But the uncertainty itself told part of the story. The field was a scene of chaos and carnage where no one could count with certainty how many had died at all.
Colonel Chivington's own dispatches spoke of a victory. Roughly 150 hostiles killed.
Yeah, a fucking 2-year-old.
Right, as he phrased it. But those who saw the aftermath told a different story. John S. Smith, a U.S. Indian agent who arrived shortly after the attack, he described the battlefield strewn with about 70 bodies, though he noted that many more were likely scattered or carried off before his arrival. His conclusion, well, it was simple. The real number was certainly higher, but no one would ever know for sure. Congressional military investigations, including testimony from Captain Silas Soule, who had refused to even fire one single bullet, settled on a consensus figure of about 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho killed. They also confirmed that Soule had insisted all along that this had not been a battle, but an attack on a defenseless camp. Jeez, oh Pete.
The demographic breakdown of the dead told the same story. Of the 70 bodies that Smith personally examined, about 30 were adult men, a few likely among the handful of warriors who tried to resist.
Right.
The rest, roughly 40, were women and children, what Smith called the greater portion of the slain.
Yeah.
Considering the camp's population, most families under Black Kettle's peaceful faction, about 500 people. The numbers that made brutal sense. Most of the able-bodied men had been away hunting or allied with other bands.
Oh, jeez.
Those left behind were the elderly, the mothers, and the young. I mean, just chilling in the neighborhood, man.
Think when those guys came back.
Right.
What the fuck?
Survivors and sympathetic officers later confirmed that few true warriors were present at all. This was not a war camp. It was a village flying both an American flag and a truce banner.
I mean, you're going to have warriors regardless if it's a peaceful camp or not.
Still got to protect it. The soldiers, by contrast, suffered little. Out of 700 men, the official reports recorded 9 or 10 dead, about 38 wounded. Casualties sustained mostly in the first chaotic volleys and friendly fire. Mostly probably friendly fire.
Right.
The imbalance is staggering. The attack had been over almost before it even began. Its outcome decided by numbers, firepower, and the villagers believed they were under protection rather than siege.
Right. Son of a bitch. Wow.
Jeez.
The layout of that camp along Sand Creek, it was open, exposed, and hemmed in by bluffs. Turned into a killing ground. Once the firing started, there was nowhere to go. No prisoners were even taken or even thought about being taken, except for a handful of small children, spared by individual soldiers only to be adopted or later released. In the very end, the official tallies read like battlefield statistics, but they masked the truth of what really happened that day. What Chivington's men called a victory was, by every account, the one-sided destruction of a peaceful encampment, a slaughter carried out under the flags of the very government that had promised those people that they would be safe. You bastards.
In the days after, the horror deepened. What had begun as a one-sided slaughter turned into something darker, something even men within the army couldn't stomach. Among them was Captain Silas Soule. In a letter to Major Edward Wynkoop, dated December 14th, 1864, Soule laid it out bare. The dead were horribly mutilated, he wrote, describing soldiers scalping the bodies, cutting off ears, and severing fingers as steel rings. 5 days later, on December 19th, he wrote again, repeating that the bodies were stripped and scalped. And many were otherwise mutilated in a most brutal manner.
Man.
These weren't secondhand reports. They were eyewitness accounts from an officer who had stood there and watched. His letters became some of the earliest and most damning evidence against Chiventing's command.
Wow. John S. Smith, interpreter and Indian agent, who visited Sand Creek shortly after, he confirmed what Soule had wrote and what he had testified to the Congress. Smith told Congress that he had seen roughly 70 bodies, almost all women and children, cut to pieces. He described soldiers using knives to scalp the dead, dragging the corpse into the sandy creek, covering them with sand and water as if to hide the evidence, you bastards. His testimony turned the stomachs of even the seasoned politicians. He recalled that among the dead, infants, brains knocked out, a level of cruelty that stripped away any illusion that this had even been close to a battle. You fucking piece of shit.
When Chiventing's men returned to Denver, the outrage only deepened then.
Why is Chivington still not court-martialed?
According to the congressional investigation, soldiers paraded scalps through the streets like trophies. Witnesses described some even fashioning tobacco pouches from the genitalia and breasts of women. The story spread quickly, first whispered and discussed, then printed in newspapers across the country. Chiventing's defenders tried to justify their atrocities by claiming the Indians had committed similar acts against white settlers. Multiple eyewitnesses within his own ranks, officers and enlisted men alike, they testified what had happened at Sand Creek went far beyond any idea of frontier retribution, especially the Army.
Right.
I can get if it was like a guerrilla group or something like that, maybe, because they'd be like brutal, but this is the Army, guys.
Wow. The Joint Committee's report in 1865 left little room for ambiguity. It described the soldiers' behavior as acts of unrestrained savagery. Noting that,
Savages now, barely even humans.
noting that, well, not every man had taken part enough to mark.
Not all.
Right. Enough had to mark the entire expedition with disgrace. The mutilations weren't the chaos of combat. No, they were not. They were deliberate, performed after the fighting was over. And in the end, Soule's letters and Smith's testimony did what the dead could not. Spoke the truth. The words peeled away Chivington's myth of victory, exposing what really happened on the banks of Sand Creek that very cold, brisk morning. Not a battle for survival, but a desecration of a village that had trusted that very flag under which it was destroyed. Ye fucking... When that gunfire finally faded in the morning of the 29th of November, 1864, the killing did not stop there. No, it did not. It just changed form. What remained of the Cheyenne and Arapaho village along Sand Creek became a scene of plunder and ruin. Colonel John Chivington's troops, their rifles still warm, fanned out through the camp and began looting what was left. They tore through the lodges, seizing household goods, jewelry, clothing, and anything of value. Once the theft was done, they set the lodges ablaze.
The village, like we said, held around 140 to 150 teepees. Each was torched and turned, the flames consuming not only homes, but the tribe's entire store of winter provisions. Dried meat, hides, and other food supplies painstakingly gathered to survive the bitter plains cold. To the soldiers, it was part of the job. To the Cheyenne and Arapaho, it was the destruction of life itself.
My goodness.
Out on the flat, soldiers rounded up the pony herd, some 2,000, that grazed near the village. The animals were prized property, the foundation of plain survival. Chivington's men drove off many and shot the rest.
You piece of shit.
Determined that none would ever be covered by those who escaped. When they were done, there was nothing. No shelter, no food, no livestock. Sand Creek had been wiped clean. Amid this devastation, a handful of survivors still clung to life. Somewhere between 100 and 200 people, including Chief Black Kettle himself, miraculously survived the onslaught by digging shallow pits along the creek bed. For hours they huddled there, listening to musket fire and the shriek of shells while the world above them burned.
Jeez. George Bent said that the soldiers fired into groups of women and children who had huddled for cover. The village was all on fire, he recalled, and the soldiers were shooting everyone they could see. When the gunfire finally slackened, the survivors were left to face the freezing wind, their blankets and shelters gone, the ground strewn with their dead. Bent, he managed to crawl away, covering 10 miles through the plains before even reaching a ravine where Cheyenne warriors found him. They lifted him onto a horse and took him north to camps along the Smoky Hill River, where grief spread like the fire that destroyed their home.
Black Kettle himself escaped, guiding what few could still travel. His wife, struck 9 times by bullets, she somehow lived, surviving wounds that would have killed almost anyone else.
Oh, shit.
The chief can't call her, they call her 50 from now on.
Right.
The chief gathered a handful of horses and slipped away upstream under the cover of darkness, heading toward Allied bands on the high plains. For others, there was no such reprieve. Arapaho and Cheyenne oral histories passed down through generations tell of entire families wiped out, of children lost in the flames, and of mothers who watched helplessly as the soldiers closed in. The survivors scattered north, some on foot, others wounded and half mad with grief, fleeing 5 or 6 miles along Sand Creek to escape further pursuit.
By nightfall, the massacre had done more than kill. It erased a whole community. Those who survived were left destitute, stripped food, shelter, horses, reliant on distant relatives for the most basic means of survival as winter closed in around them. Sand Creek, it was no longer a camp, it was a graveyard. And a scar that would never fade from the Cheyenne or the Arapaho memory. Word spread very fast. Within weeks, the story of what Colonel John Chivington and his men had done in Colorado reached the highest levels of the government. What followed was a cascade of investigations, each one peeling back another layer of what had happened that November morning. 13th of January, 1865, the request of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, he ordered a military commission. He wanted them to convene. Well, its purpose, you ask? Very simple. Examine the conduct of Chivington and the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. The hearings were held first in Denver, then in Fort Lyon. Witnesses included soldiers who had fought at Sand Creek, killed at Sand Creek,
right.
Officers who had refused to, and others who'd seen the carnage firsthand. So they wanted everybody there, huh? The testimonies painted a fractured picture, conflicting accounts of how many had been killed, who those victims even were, whether the Cheyenne or Arapaho had even posed a threat at all. Still, even at this early stage, one thing was certain. Among the dead were scores of women and children shot down under the flags of peace.
At the same time, a separate, quieter inquiry had already begun. Major Edward Wynkoop, the former commander at Fort Lyon, the same officer who had once promised Black Kettle and his people protection, he conducted his own investigation. He interviewed survivors and subordinates, collecting accounts that contradicted everything Chivington had claimed. Wynkoop's report stated flatly that the camp had been under federal protection, flying both the American flag and white flags. Chivington's version of events, he said, told a battle of against 9 to 1,000 hostile warriors.
He's a lying whore.
But Wynkoop's evidence shredded that story. He estimated the camp had fewer than 500 people total, which we know very few were warriors.
Mm-hmm.
His finding reached higher command and quickly fueled calls for a deeper federal investigation. And that's when the Joint Committee on the Conduct of War came in. By March of 1865, the committee had turned in its full attention to Sand Creek. It summoned the key players to Washington, Chivington, Governor John Evans, and officers like Captain Silas Soule, who dared to defy the orders during the massacre.
Right. In sworn testimony, Soule didn't mince his words at all. He told the committee that the attack had been launched against a sleeping village, one that had offered minimal resistance. He described how roughly 150 to 200 people had been murdered, 2/3 women, children, and how the soldiers continued firing even long after the fighting had ended, just hunting down whoever was left crawling around. When the Joint Committee's report was released, June of 1865, it was titled simply, Massacre of the Cheyenne Indians.
The Arapaho's like, what the fuck?
Right. Its language left no room for debate. The committee condemned Sand Creek as a cowardly and a sanguinary massacre. They declared it devoid of any military necessity.
Chivington trying to fucking be a big bad guy and prove something when all he did was prove he's a piece of shit.
Wow. The report cited mutilations, destruction of non-combatant property, violation of U.S. promises to peaceful tribes. Responsibility, it said, lay squarely with Chivington, who had ignored direct orders to spare friendly bands. Yes, he did.
But in the end, justice proved elusive. By the time the report was published, Chivington had already resigned his commission. As a civilian, he was beyond the reach of a court-martial. That's bullshit.
Mm-mm.
The committee could recommend his removal from command, but there were no criminal charges to bring anyways, they say.
Well, we put him in as a serial killer or something.
Right. Or a mass
Spree
murderer.
killer, yeah.
The series of inquiries, military, congressional, and local, did at least force a reckoning. They exposed the contradictions and failures that had plagued U.S. Indian policy in the territories and cast a harsh light on the government's promises versus its actions. Though Colorado's political leadership resisted accountability, the scandal shaped the next round of treaty negotiations with the Plains tribes. When the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War convened its hearings in early 1865, few witnesses carried more weight or moral gravity than Captain Silas Soule. As commander of Company D, Soule had been on the field, yes. He had seen everything. Before the committee, he testified that the Cheyenne and Arapaho village had flown the 2 flags that we said. He stated plainly he observed no initial resistance from the people in the camp, who he told the senators, once again...
And even if there was, what do you expect?
Right. Mostly women, children, and elderly men. Despite this, he said Colonel Chivington had given the order to attack anyways.
Piece of shit. Sol explained that when the volleys began, he instructed his own company. He said, "We're not firing," believing the encampment was non-hostile. His men obeyed, standing aside as others stormed the village. In a letter to Major Edward Wincoop, Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, he served under Sol that morning. He backed up his commander's account. In both his letters and testimony, Kramer said he too had refused to fire, describing the camp as peaceful and unfortified, with the U.S. flag flying above it and the old truce flag right beneath. He told that very committee that what took place was a massacre, a defenseless massacre.
Once again, those words were echoed by John Smith. Smith's account also confirmed that Chief Black Kettle had been given explicit assurances of safety, assurances the Army ignored clearly. Then, old piece of shit Chivington, he comes on the stand.
See what he has.
April 26, 1865, the colonel sat before the same committee, still defiant. He insisted the Sand Creek encampment had been a legitimate military target, housing up to 1,000 warriors, including hostile elements that Black Kettle supposedly couldn't control. He claimed his men had taken fire upon approach, justified what he called a preemptive strike against tribes responsible for raids in Colorado settlements earlier that year, including the infamous Hungate family murders we mentioned. Chivington described the action as a victory, boasting that 500 to 600 Indians had been killed, mostly warriors.
Why do you keep on lying?
While his own force, he said, had lost only 9 dead and 40 wounded. As for the flags of truce, he dismissed them outright, saying they meant nothing. It was a trick, he suggested. It's from tribes who had long since forfeited trust.
Oh, jeez.
Major Scott Anthony, who had commanded one of the battalions under Chivington, he supported his superior, at least in part. He told the committee that scouts had reported mounted warriors nearby, and the camp's location along Sand Creek matched known routes of hostile Cheyenne movements. But even Anthony admitted that post-combat excesses occurred, though he stopped short of blaming Chivington directly. Piece of shit.
Wow. Well, in the end, the testimonies diverged sharply. Sol, Kramer, and Smith described a peaceful village, unarmed and unprepared, while Chivington and his supporters portrayed Sand Creek as a justified military strike against an enemy force. Yet the evidence spoke for itself. Chivington was a bold-faced liar. The low soldier casualties, the absence of fortifications, the overwhelming number of women and children dead contradicted Chivington's claims.
You think?
By the time the Joint Committee released its report in June of 1865, the verdict was unmistakable. The panel credited the anti-Chivington witnesses, citing their consistent details and physical evidence of peace symbols in the village. The report describes Sand Creek attack as a cowardly and sanguinary massacre, condemning Chivington for inflating enemy numbers and ignoring direct orders to spare friendly tribes.
Well, still, the controversy didn't die easily. Military circles across the frontier, defenders of Chivington clung to his narrative, arguing that he had acted on credible intelligence in time of chaos. He didn't. But the truth, preserved in the words of those who refused to fire, painted a different picture. Sol's courage in testifying and his refusal to participate made him a rare figure in a brutal war. As a soldier who had seen evil and called it by its name.
Got to.
In the months following, the man at the center of it all, Chivington, found himself facing the full weight of federal scrutiny. Once celebrated in Denver as the fighting parson who had tamed the frontier, Chivington now stood accused of orchestrating one of the worst, most shameful atrocities in American military history. Like we said, that committee report concluded that Chivington had surprised and murdered in the most cowardly manner a friendly village of Indians, and that he'd done so deliberately, despite the presence of flags of truce and the American flag. The report's language was blistering. The Sand Creek operation, it said, is not an act of war, but of premeditated slaughter.
Yep. Wow. The committee placed full responsibility on Chivington for planning and carrying out this attack. They called his actions inhumane and without justification. It recommended that he face military accountability, but when it came time to enforce that justice, bureaucracy and timing intervened. By then, Chivington's commission with the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, a temporary volunteer unit, raised for 100 days, had expired. So what? He did it while he was there.
Right.
With his militia service over and no longer part of the regular army, he was beyond the reach of a court-martial.
Yes, nothing you can do to a citizen, I guess.
The ongoing turmoil of frontier Indian wars in Colorado, combined with Territory's sympathetic political leadership, helped insulate him further. In January 1865, shortly after his testimony before the committee, Chivington quietly resigned his command, ending his military career just as the storm around him began to gather. What a piece of shit this guy is.
The court of public opinion was less forgiving. News of the massacre and the grisly details that emerged from the congressional hearings spread across the country, turning the one-time hero into a national disgrace. Chivington tried to salvage his reputation with a bid for Congress later that year, but the backlash was overwhelming. What a fucking retard. He withdrew from the race amid public outrage.
Can't even believe he even tried.
The nerve of this guy.
Right.
Still, not everyone condemned him. In Denver, a loyal faction of settlers and veterans continued to hail him as a man who had defended the frontier against the evil Cheyenne and Arapaho.
I guess probably a lot of people were still thinking that.
Scandal didn't stop with him either. Governor John Evans, who had issued the June and August 1864 proclamations, he came under fire as well. Investigators accused him of creating the environment that blurred the line between peaceful and hostile tribes, effectively paving the way for what happened at Sand Creek. Yeah, when you create proclamations saying go out and basically hunt Indians, what the fuck do you think is going to happen?
Evans defended himself vigorously, claiming he had not even no knowledge of Chivington's specific target, and that his proclamations were meant only to mobilize settlers against proven aggressors. But as explanations rang hollow in Washington, the inquiries made it clear that Evans' aggressive policies and rhetoric had directly contributed to the tragedy, eroding what little trust remained between Colorado's leadership and the federal government. Under growing pressure and facing the collapse of his political career, Evans resigned as the governor on August 1st, 1865. President Andrew Johnson, he soon appointed Alexander Cummings as his replacement, signaling Washington's desire to wipe the slate clean in Colorado's territorial administration.
Well, neither Chivington nor Evans would ever face criminal charges.
Yeah, that's bullshit.
Both men escaped legal accountability, but neither escaped history's judgment.
Yeah, who cares?
Chivington retreated into obscurity, his reputation forever stained by the word massacre. Evans, likewise, withdrew from public office, turned back to medicine and philanthropy in later years. But the stain of Sand Creek followed him for the rest of his life as well. For the survivors and those who testified against it, the lack of punishment was salt in an open wound. In the bitter winter that followed the Sand Creek Massacre, grief turned to fury. Across the plains, Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors, especially members of the fierce Dog Soldier Society, they took up arms to avenge the slaughter of their people.
I mean, what do you think they were going to do? Holy shit.
Between January and February of 1865, bands of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux struck out along the South Platte River, targeting settlements, ranches, and stage stations across nearly 100 miles of frontier from eastern Colorado into Nebraska. They cut telegraph lines, burned outposts, hit wagon trains and mail routes, effectively choking off communication and trade across the plains. These raids weren't random. They were direct retaliation for the massacre.
As they should have been.
A message that blood had to be repaid with blood. And blood only.
I mean, come on, since the government ain't doing shit about it.
Right.
The Dog Soldiers led the charge, men who had long rejected any idea of peace or surrender. The raid stood in sharp contrast to the approach of leaders like Black Kettle, who continued to preach restraint and reconciliation, even as his own family and people lay dead. And that's what the warriors are saying. The most emphasis of these reprisal raids came on January 7th, 1865, when hundreds of warriors descended on Julesburg, Colorado. The town was little more than a cluster of buildings along the Overland Trail. It was overrun in hours. Cheyenne, Arapaho, Lakota, they burned the station, killed settlers, captured horses and supplies, shouted the names of those, say their names, shouted the names of people they have lost. To the soldiers and settlers who survived, it felt like the frontier was on fire once again.
These raids continued for weeks, hitting isolated homesteads, wagon trains, and ranches across Colorado and western Nebraska. Settlers abandoned their farms and the overland routes fell into chaos. Ironically, the massacre that had decimated Cheyenne leadership also unified the surviving bands, transforming grief into resolve. Once fractured tribal divisions dissolved, vengeance had made them one. These retaliations quickly escalated the localized Colorado War into a broader conflict, the beginning of the Old Plains Indian Wars that would rage for more than a decade. Cheyenne and Arapaho forged new alliances with the Lakota Sioux, extending the fight northward or across the Great Plains. In response, the military stepped up its efforts. Well, it's just the last thing you could do, right?
Right.
Launching punitive expeditions to protect settlers and immigrant trails while branding all native forces as hostile. Did you learn a lesson?
Right, shit.
Cycle of violence that began at Sand Creek would ripple outward for years, feeding into the 1865 Sioux War and the later campaigns under generals like Philip Sheridan, who would oversee a policy of systematic subjugation against the nomadic tribes of the plains. Yeah, he went in and destroyed some shit.
Yeah. Wow. By August of 1865, the violence had reached a stalemate, both sides exhausted. Civil war ending back east, Washington eager to stabilize the frontier. To that end, United States officials convened peace talks on the Little Arkansas River. This is in Kansas, about 8 miles above its junction with the Walnut River. The meeting brought together an impressive cast, representing in U.S. Commissioners John Sanborn, William Harney, Thomas Murphy, Kit Carson.
Kit Carson, you know, the guy that participated in a questionable massacre out west.
Right.
That we covered in Fremont's episode, I believe.
Yes. William W. Bent, Jesse Leavenworth, and James Steele. On the native side sat a roster of the Southern Plains' most prominent chiefs: Black Kettle, Seven Bulls, Little Robe, Little Raven, and others. The famed interpreter, Jesse Chisholm, who knew nearly every tongue on the plains. They helped bridge the gap between them. Negotiations aimed to end hostilities, settle grievances from Sand Creek, and establish a more permanent system of peace and relocation. The talks unfolded against
the key one being that last word.
Right.
Relocation.
The talks unfolded against the backdrop of anger and loss. The Cheyenne and Arapaho came demanding recognition of what had been done to them and compensation for that, but they want reparations. After weeks of counsel, the resultant agreement, the Treaty of Little Arkansas, signed October 14th, 1865, it became one of the most consequential documents in Plains history. The Senate ratified it on the 22nd of May, 1866. Andrew Johnson proclaimed it into law on the 2nd of February, 1867. Jeez, all that, why does it take so fucking long?
The treaty's language was unusually direct. It condemned all acts of violence against peaceful tribes.
It had to be unusually direct because fuckers didn't know how to
interpret it your own way.
Right.
And it declared that future disputes would be settled through arbitration rather than war. I mean, can't we do that with everything? Both sides pledged perpetual peace, though the reality of such a promise was already in doubt. Key provisions of this treaty were land cessions and reservations. The Cheyenne and Arapaho formally relinquished all claims north of the Arkansas River, including their traditional hunting grounds between the Platte and Arkansas Rivers stretching to the Rocky Mountains. Wow. In exchange, the United States promised them a new reservation south of the Arkansas River.
I'm sure they did.
Between Red Creek and the Cimarron River and what was then Indian territory of modern Oklahoma. Jeez. And they accepted this? This treaty allowed the government to build roads, forts, and military posts on the land, provided damages were compensated. Right. The tribes were permitted to range north temporarily until relocation was complete, but the move south was inevitable. In effect, the Cheyenne and Arapaho ceded most of present-day Kansas and eastern Colorado to make way for the surge of whiteys and railroads pushing west.
Jesus, it never ends. Annuities and economic support we'll take a look at. The United States government promised annual payments of $20 per person until the tribes were relocated, increasing to $40 per person for 40 years after that. Huh. These annuities were meant to fund agriculture.
No inflation, though.
Right. These were meant to fund agriculture, education, and self-sufficiency, with provisions for schools, blacksmiths, farming tools, and teachers to train the tribes in farming. I think that they know how to farm.
They really didn't, though.
Right.
Not like they know how to grow like corn and squash and shit. That was about it.
All right. Reparations for Sand Creek, you ask? Well, in a remarkable admission of guilt, Article 6 of the treaty directly addresses Sand Creek Massacre, acknowledging the destruction of life and property on the 29th of November, 1864. It promised full indemnity for the families of those killed to be paid in livestock, goods, or government securities.
It also had specific land grants, and they were issued as restitution in this treaty. 640 acres to each designated mixed blood individual related by blood to the tribes. 320 acres to 5 named chiefs, including Black Kettle, and 160 acres to every widow, orphan, or family head affected by the massacre. The treaty also nullified earlier agreements, such as the 1861 Treaty of Fort Wise, and sought to unite all Cheyenne and Arapaho under a single framework. The militant dog soldiers, however, refused to attend the council and rejected its terms outright. Of course they did. In the wake of Sand Creek, as settlers poured into the region, Congress and military authorities seized the opportunity to consolidate control. The once vast territories promised under the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty were now viewed as obstacles to statehood, railroads, and gold. What had begun as a frontier tragedy soon became a pretext for a permanent removal. The Treaty of Little Arkansas, signed October 14, 1865, was the government's official attempt to atone for the massacre and quote-unquote settle the Cheyenne and Arapaho question once and for all. On paper, it appeared generous.
Yeah, I'm sure it did.
The treaty promised reparations for Sand Creek, acknowledging the wrongs committed, and designated reservations in present-day Kansas and Nebraska, totaling about 3.5 million acres south of the Platte River.
Okay, see how long that lasts.
Right. The lands were to be placed under the supervision of the Secretary of the Interior, theoretically safeguarding them for tribal use. Theoretically.
Yeah, we all know that. Wow. But when the treaty reached Washington, politics took over. Senate ratified it in 1866 only after amending it beyond recognition.
Of course.
Cut more than
Wait a
9.
minute. We gave them 1.5 million acres of land. Are you guys retarded? We're going to give them 200.
Right. They cut more than 90% of the promised land. The supposed reservations were never fully established. Reparations written into the treaty became hollow words. The agreement that had been meant to heal on Sand Creek's wounds, instead opening a new chapter of betrayal. And this never stops. After and after. I mean, Black Kettle, you better... It's time for you to be like, hey, all right, dog soldiers.
Right. Go do your thing.
Right. As the 1860s wore on, violence again filled the plains. Campaigns by the United States Army, ostensibly to protect settlers, further eroded Cheyenne and Arapaho autonomy. By 1867, with resistance exhausted, leadership fractured, new negotiations began at Medicine's Lodge Creek. Stop negotiating. The resultant treaty of October 1867 forced the Cheyenne and Arapaho to relinquish all remaining claims in Kansas and relocate again, supposedly permanently, to the Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, yeah.
Wow.
The new reservation covered about 3 million acres to be shared with other displaced tribes. On paper, it required 3/4 of the adult male population to approve any future land cessions, a supposed safeguard against further loss. In practice, it locked the Cheyenne and Arapaho into a system designed to ensure their permanent removal from Colorado. Their rights north of the Arkansas River were extinguished, clearing the way for railroads, mining booms, and the settler expansion that would define the new state's future. By 1876, when Colorado entered the Union as a state, the process was complete. The new boundaries enclosed land once promised to the Cheyenne and Arapaho, now gone without a trace of tribal ownership or legal recognition. The people who had once hunted freely from the Platte River to the Arkansas, across the wide grasslands of eastern Colorado, they were absent from the very ground that bore their history.
Wow. The decades that followed, survivors scattered across the plains. Southern Cheyenne, Arapaho confined to a reservation in Oklahoma, which continued to shrink under the weight of federal policy. The Dawes Act of 1887, which divided tribal lands into individual allotments, stripped away even more. By the early 20th century, the once 3 million acre, guess what? 444,000. That's sad.
Why did they have to? I don't understand why they had to put these guys into like one space. Let them go out and just live somewhere. Who gives a fuck?
Right. Holy shit. Meanwhile, Northern Cheyenne, who refused to move south, endured further war and exile before securing a small reservation in Montana in 1884. Together, the northern and southern divisions had lost over 90% of their pre-1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, including their prime buffalo ranges in Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska. This forced confinement severed the people from their sacred geography, the hunting grounds, migration routes, holy sites that defined the world. Even Sand Creek itself, the site of their greatest tragedy, lay far beyond their reach. Wow.
By the time the dust settled on Sand Creek, its story had already divided the nation. Today, the prevailing historical consensus is clear. What happened was not a battle, but a massacre. In 2007, the National Park Service established the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site.
Aw, finally.
Ensuring that the memory preserved... Yeah, 2007.
Right.
Ensuring that the memory preserved there reflects the victims' peaceful status and the violation of federal protection that led to their deaths.
Wow. In the end, the debate over Sand Creek has never been about whether people died, but why they died and what the attack represented. To some, it was the darkest stain on Colorado's frontier history, a massacre of the innocent. To others, it was a desperate act in a desperate war, born of fear, rage, and chaos on a lawless frontier. A century and a half later, the ground at Sand Creek still holds both stories, the soldiers' justification and the voices of those who never had the chance to tell theirs. For more than a century and a half after the smoke cleared over Sand Creek, the ground where it had happened has become not just a historical site, but a place of memory, mourning, and meaning. The heart of the remembrance lies at the Sand Creek Massacre National Historical Site, a stretch of quiet prairie in Kiowa County near Eads, Colorado. Authorized by Congress in 2000 and officially in 2007. The site marks the very place where the people were murdered. Covering 12,683 acres, the park preserves the contours of the creek, the bluffs, and the open plains where the attack unfolded. A landscape that still looks hauntingly similar to how it did that very morning.
Assume. Before it became a National Historic Site, Sand Creek had been quietly marked since 1950 by a simple monument, a local effort to acknowledge the event's location. For decades, that stone marker stood alone against the wind, bearing witness to a tragedy the wider world often tried to forget. Over the last 2 decades, efforts to preserve and expand the site have accelerated. In October 2022, the National Park Service added 3,478 acres through purchases from willing sellers, bringing federal protection in another 6,500 acres surrounding the massacre's core. Then in May 2023, another 3,400 acres were secured, this time through partnerships with the National Park Foundation, the Conservation Fund, and other preservation allies. These expansions have created crucial buffer zones against encroaching development and environmental erosion, ensuring that the site remains intact for future generations.
Oh, that's nice.
Nice.
In recent years, the focus has shifted from preservation to education, from silence to storytelling. December of 2023, the site unveiled a major new exhibition titled The Sand Creek Massacre, the betrayal that changed Cheyenne and Arapaho people forever. It was developed jointly by the National Park Service and History Colorado. The exhibit combines tribal oral histories, archival records, survivor accounts to tell the story through native eyes. For many descendants, it's marked the first time the government's interpretation aligned with the truth that has been passed down through their family.
Each year, the grounds also serve as a gathering place for the remembrance and healing. The annual ceremonial run, begun decades ago by descendants of survivors, it resumed in November 24 after a long hiatus after, we don't mention 2020. The run traces the path from Eads to the massacre site, ending with prayer, songs, and stories. A living bridge between past and present, grief and endurance. Behind those commemorations stand the Sand Creek Massacre Foundation, a coalition of tribal, local, and state advocates dedicated to honor the dead and preserving the truth. In 2025, the foundation supported House Joint Resolution 25-1024 in the Colorado legislature, reaffirming the state's commitment to memorialize the massacre and to strengthen collaboration with the tribal nations and the National Park Service in managing the site. Together, these initiatives reflect a broader vision, one of a shared stewardship. The goal is to protect Sand Creek not only as a federal historic site, but as a sacred space, where Cheyenne and Arapaho voices guide interpretation and policy. Challenges remain: funding lapses, limited infrastructure, and the site's remote access via unpaved roads. Pave them. But the commitment endures. Today, as the wind moves through the tall grass along Sand Creek, it carries more than the sound of history. It carries the memory of those who fell, the resilience of those who survived, and the determination of their descendants to ensure the world never forgets what happened. The story of Sand Creek does not end in 1864. It continues each year in the footsteps of those who return to remember.
Yeah, terrible. And it's terrible that that Shivington guy, he could have easily got charged. But I guess, whatever.
Should have sentenced his ass to death. It's fucking ridiculous.
They should have let him go with Custer.
Right. Well, I don't think anybody knew Custer was going to get killed, but, I mean, that's the Sand Creek Massacre. We covered it
Ooh, it's raining.
a little bit on our episode on Sand Creek way back, but not in this detail. So there's that. Next week, we'll continue with the war crimes / atrocities, and this time we're heading over to the Confederate side, where we're going to take a look at the Fort Pillow Massacre,
Ooh.
which is the unarmed killing of unarmed and surrendering black forces at the fort after the fort was taken.
Jeez.
And just as brutal as this one.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll do that, and we got a couple more atrocities in the coming week, so both sides did it, and both were pieces of shit for doing it.
Yeah,
so.
the blue coats got themselves a big old stain on this one here. Women and children. I mean, come on.
They sure do. Yeah, that's that. So, like, subscribe, share this with your friends, leave us a review, leave us a comment.
If we missed anything in this, Let us know.
I don't think it's possible. We said the same things, repeated to what happened 75 fucking thousand times. So, yeah, we'll be back next week for the Fort Pillow Massacre on the Confederate side. And we'll see you then. We're the month of Michigan this week.
Dang, dang.